Ready for a deep dive? We're really going deep with Ta-Nehisi Coates and his new book, The Message.
Yeah, this one really gets into it.
It does. It really does. Race, history, storytelling.
And he does not let you off easy. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like he's challenging himself just as much as he's challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And, he starts with his younger self.
Right.
He's in Baltimore. He's captivated by comic books and cartoons and all that.
Sure.
And then, bam, reality hits.
Yeah.
And he reads this article in Sports Illustrated about Darryl Stingley.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, vaguely.
So Darryl Stingley was this football player who was paralyzed by this brutal tackle.
Oh, right. Yeah, now I remember. Wow.
And for Coates, this was huge. It wasn't a comic book villain anymore.
Yeah.
This was real life with real consequences.
And I think for him, that's got to make you think about justice, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're younger and you think about good guys and bad guys, it's kind of simple. But this is like,
It's not black and white anymore.
no, not at all. And that's what I appreciate about Coates. He's not afraid to
go there.
to go there, to those uncomfortable places.
Okay, so then he takes us to Dakar, Senegal.
What a shift.
Talk about a shift.
I mean, going from this really intense personal reflection to
Africa. But it's not just a travelogue,
No, not at all.
He's using Dakar, this whole experience, to confront his own ideas about Africa, about being black in the world.
And what I find so fascinating is how he describes Dakar. He
Yeah.
went in with certain expectations, and then
Don't leave me hanging. The city just explodes those expectations. The energy, the people, the beauty, it all just upends his worldview.
it's like he's seeing the real Africa, not the one that's been filtered through like Western media and all that.
Exactly. And he even talks about feeling surprised by the beauty, which I thought was really interesting. Because it reveals these layers of internalized bias that we often don't even realize we have. Like, why should he be surprised?
Right. And that's what makes this book so powerful. He's willing to be that vulnerable to show us his own blind spots.
And then there's that encounter with the Senegalese woman.
No, tell me about her.
He's talking about how beautiful the people are, and she basically calls him out on it.
No way.
Yeah, she's like, why are you surprised? And it's not confrontational, but she's definitely challenging him.
That's amazing.
She introduces this whole concept of being mixed, which in Senegal, it's not the same as in the U.S.
Right.
It's like this whole other layer of complexity when it comes to race and identity.
Absolutely. And it shows how our understanding of these categories, these labels, is so culturally specific.
She throws the one-drop rule right back at him.
Oh, I bet that was eye-opening for him.
You can just tell this encounter was huge for him. It made me really confront the global reach of these ideas about race.
It's like a light bulb moment. You realize these narratives, they're not just stories, they have real power.
They shape how we see the world, how we see ourselves.
And sometimes those narratives are manipulated, especially historical ones.
To control the narrative, right, to maintain power.
Exactly. And he gives the example of ancient Egypt, like how Egyptology was often used to separate Egypt from Africa.
Like it was a separate civilization, not a part of the African continent.
Right. And that narrative served a purpose. It reinforced certain power structures.
And it's something he connects to his own experiences, believe it or not.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
He talks about how, as kids, we all justify things we do, even when we know they're wrong.
Oh, totally. We create these stories in our head.
Exactly. And he's saying that same impulse, that need to rationalize, it plays out on a much larger scale with history.
We choose the narratives that make us comfortable, that justify our actions, even on a societal level.
It's really kind of brilliant when you think about it. And it's not just ancient history. He brings it right into the present.
How so?
He talks about his experiences teaching.
Oh, interesting.
And the challenges of getting students to think critically, especially about sensitive topics.
That's got to be tough, especially in today's climate.
It is. And that's where he brings up the idea of safe spaces.
Safe spaces.
Yeah, he's not talking about shielding students from discomfort, but about creating an environment where they can dissect these harmful narratives, challenge them without fear of judgment.
So it's more about fostering that critical engagement, that back and forth.
Exactly. He talks about this guest lecturer on eugenics at this historically black university where he taught.
Oh, wow. That's a heavy topic.
It was. But because of the environment, the students, they felt empowered to challenge the lecturer, to really engage critically with these dangerous ideas.
That's amazing. It shows how important that context is, that feeling of safety and trust.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where those uncomfortable conversations can happen because that's how we learn. That's how we grow.
It's about pushing past those comfort zones. And I think that's something Coates does brilliantly in this book.
And this leads us to what I found to be the most impactful part, his trip to Palestine.
Palestine. Okay, now we're getting into it.
This is where everything changes for him. His whole understanding of global oppression, his role as a writer, it all shifts.
So I can already tell this is where things get really real.
They do, but we'll save that for next time. So last time we left off with Coates about to embark on this journey to Palestine, this pivotal point in the book.
And you can already sense, right, this is where his whole worldview starts to unravel. Like those threads he's been pulling at about race and history and storytelling, they all come together in Palestine.
They do. And it's not pretty, but it's real, it's raw.
That's what makes Coates such a compelling writer, though. Yeah. He doesn't shy away from the hard stuff. In fact, he leans right into it.
He does. So he starts in this really unexpected place, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center.
Wow. Talk about a heavy experience, right?
Incredibly heavy. And he describes it so vividly, you feel like you're right there with him, the weight of history, the grief, the magnitude of it all.
I think for a lot of people, that's the starting point for understanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
Right, that narrative of the Holocaust, of Jewish suffering.
It's a powerful narrative. And Coates, he doesn't diminish that suffering at all, but he starts to unpack this idea of redemptive violence.
Redemptive violence.
Yeah, like the idea that violence can be justified, even necessary, as a response to past suffering. And he uses this book, Exodus, by Leon Uris, as an example.
Okay, so not exactly light reading material.
No, not at all. But it was hugely influential, especially for American audiences. And Coates argues that it painted this very particular picture of the conflict. Israelis as these heroic liberators and Palestinians as, well, obstacles in the way of that liberation.
So he's saying that this one book, this one story, shaped how an entire generation viewed this incredibly complex conflict.
Exactly. And he's not just critiquing the book itself, but how that narrative seeped into the public consciousness, becoming the lens through which people saw things. And it's something he grappled with, too. He talks about how his own initial understanding of the conflict was shaped by those same narratives.
It's like he's taking us along this journey of unlearning, of dismantling those deeply ingrained ideas.
Yes. And it's not easy. He talks about feeling this growing disillusionment as he starts to engage with the Palestinian narrative, with the realities on the ground.
Well, and the reality is they're two very different narratives at play here. Mm-hmm. And often only one gets told, or at least one gets privileged over the other.
Exactly. And his time in Hebron really drives that home. He describes it as a city-divided, barbed wire checkpoints, this constant tension in the air.
He talks about how Palestinian life is just so constricted, controlled. And then you have the Israeli settlers, this whole other layer of complexity added to the mix.
It's like this powder keg ready to explode at any moment. And he doesn't just tell you about it. He makes you feel it. The fear, the resentment, the hopelessness.
He's a master of immersing you in that experience, making it visceral. And that's where his talent as a storyteller really shines through.
It does. And he ties it back to this theme of storytelling with his visit to the city of David.
Okay, I've heard of this place. It's like this huge archaeological site, right?
It is. And it's presented as this celebration of Jewish history, this reclaiming of their ancient roots.
Which on the surface seems fine, right?
Yeah.
Like what's wrong with celebrating your history?
Right. But Coates sees this other layer. He argues that it's not just about celebrating one history, it's about erasing another.
Wow. So it's like this physical manifestation of that narrative control we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. It's about using history, or at least a particular interpretation of history, to justify the present-day reality. And it gets even weirder.
Weirder? How so?
They're planning on building a cable car there.
And a zip line?
A zip line. Like, imagine that. This ancient site, steeped in history and conflict, and you're going to have tourists zipping around on a frickin' zip line.
It's almost like this bizarre attempt to Disneyfy it, to sanitize it.
That's exactly what it felt like to me. Like they're trying to pave over the complexity, the ugliness of it all with this veneer of entertainment.
It's disturbing when you think about it.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this idea that even our attempts to engage with history can be manipulative, can reinforce those power dynamics we claim to oppose.
And that brings us to perhaps the most difficult part of the book, Deir Yassin.
Deir Yassin. That name has this weight to it.
It does. And for good reason. It was the site of a massacre in 1948. Hundreds of Palestinians killed by Zionist militias. And it's just a short distance from Yad Vashem, yet it's shrouded in this almost deafening silence.
It's like this ghost in the narrative, this event that's been deliberately erased, forgotten.
And that's exactly what Coates is trying to draw attention to, this selective remembering, this curated history that serves a purpose.
He talks about how even he, someone who went in with a critical eye, had unconsciously bought into certain narratives. He had to confront his own blind spots, his own complicity in perpetuating those silences.
It's a humbling realization, and it's something I think a lot of us can relate to, regardless of our political stances. How often do we question the stories we're told? How often do we seek out those alternative narratives, those silenced voices?
Especially when those narratives make us uncomfortable, when they challenge our worldview.
Exactly. And that's where the real work begins. It's like this idea that even when someone tries to bury a story, to silence it, it still finds a way to surface.
It's like those wildflowers, pushing up through the cracks in the pavement. Life finds a way.
Exactly. And that resilience, that determination to be heard, it's what makes the message so powerful. It's more than just one man's journey. It's this call to action.
Absolutely. Coates isn't just asking us to read about these things, to passively consume these stories. He wants us to do something with them.
To engage with them, right.
Yes. To question, to challenge, to use our own voices, to amplify those that have been silenced.
He talks about coming to understand the power of his own voice, not just as a writer, but as a Black man, navigating a world that often tries to define him.
And that understanding, it just keeps deepening. The more he travels, the more he listens to other people's stories.
It's like these encounters, these experiences, they chip away at his preconceived notions, force him to confront those uncomfortable truths.
It's like he says, sometimes to see one's own country clearly, one must leave it.
And it makes you think, how often do we limit our own understanding by clinging to the narratives that make us comfortable, that reinforce what we already think we know?
It's so easy to stay in that echo chamber, surrounded by people who look like us, think like us. But Coates is urging us to break out of that.
To get uncomfortable.
Exactly, to challenge those comfortable narratives. And he doesn't let anyone off the hook, by the way.
Oh, no, he definitely doesn't.
He even draws parallels between Israel's past alliance with apartheid South Africa,
Yeah, he talks about how these regimes, they collaborated, shared tactics, reinforced those systems of oppression.
Because it's all connected, you see. These injustices, they don't exist in isolation.
It's like this global network of oppression, of exploitation, and often it's the same narratives that fuel it.
The narratives of power, of dominance, of us versus them. And Coates is challenging us to examine our own complicity in those narratives.
Right. It's not about being perfect or getting it right all the time. It's about being aware, being willing to listen and learn and change.
And to act. Don't forget about the action.
Right, because awareness without action, it's meaningless. So as we kind of come to the end of this deep dive into the message, the question I keep coming back to is, what do we do with this?
What do we do with those uncomfortable truths, with that call to action?
Exactly. How do we take these reflections and apply them to our own lives?
Well, I think it starts with being honest with ourselves about the stories we've been told, the ones we tell ourselves.
And then, like you said, being willing to listen to those other stories, the ones that might challenge us, might make us uncomfortable.
And to use our voices, to speak up for what we believe in, to amplify those voices that have been marginalized, silenced.
To be the change we want to see in the world. It sounds so cliche, but it's true.
It is. And we can all do it in our own ways, whether it's through our work, our relationships, our art. Every voice matters.
Every story matters. So tell yours.